All right, today my guest is Nicole Porter, an Essence Magazine new civil rights leader and the director of advocacy at the Sentencing Project. For those who don't know, the Sentencing Project works for a fair and effective U.S. criminal justice system by producing research that promotes reforms in sentencing policy, addresses unjust racial disparities and practices, and advocates for alternatives to incarceration, something that's very important to me. And I can say that it is, at least in part, because of the Sentencing Project that, in their 3 decades of work, that many of us understand better the U.S.'s position as a world leader in incarceration, not something that we should be very proud of. That we understand the racial disparities that pervade the criminal justice system, that there are more than 6 million Americans who can't vote because of felony convictions, which is incredibly important now as we head to our next election, and that thousands of predominantly women and children don't have access to food stamps or other forms of cash assistance as a result of convictions for drug offenses. Thank you for joining me. I hope
thanks for having me.
that all made sense. As director of advocacy, the first question I had for you is exactly what that means, what your role at the Sentencing Project is exactly.
Yeah, and I thank you for the question. Well, the Sentencing Project is a small organization, only a staff of about 10, and we're a research and advocacy organization. We publish, a handful of major research reports a year. Our we have several priorities, but 2 key priorities are, one, a census of people serving life sentences. So we've generated some of the national statistics and information around that. Over 206,000 people are currently sentenced to life prison terms. That's about 1 out of every 7 people in prison.
Wow.
And then we also, and you mentioned this in your introductory comments, estimate the number of people who are impacted by felony disenfranchisement around the country. And the first numbers around that were published by my now retired executive director, my former boss, Mark Maurer, who retired earlier this year. He and a colleague with Human Rights Watch published some of the first numbers around that in the late 90s. So the Sentencing Project has worked to document these 2 very significant parts of the criminal legal system, since it's been around, over 30 years since it's been around. And as the advocacy director, I work to connect those research findings to actual issue campaigns where activists and reformers are using that research, leveraging that research to help move the conversation forward around progressive reforms, to shift and reshape, reorient progressive norms in the United States around the criminal legal system. So specifically, the Sentencing Project is what I like to describe as a bridge organization between the activists and the academy. So we work to make our research reports and other research findings that researchers and academics publish related to criminal legal practices and policies, work to make that usable for the general public, with the goal of shaping progressive norms around criminal legal responses and responses to crime in the United States, rather than relying on imprisonment and the punitive nature of criminal justice that can even extend beyond a prison cell or a jail cell and follow people for the rest of their lives. And you touched on that related to voting, and also public benefits bans for people with direct felony convictions as well.
Right. And what would you consider to be some of the most important ways that you have been able to leverage the Sentencing Project's research to make positive change?
Well, I've been with the Sentencing Project over 10 years, and I've definitely seen the orientation of the Sentencing Project move the conversation forward and its approach work. So while I've been on staff, several national reports have been published, one being a 2016 report that identified the highest rates of racial disparity within states. And in that analysis, my colleague, Ashleen Ellis, found that New Jersey had the highest rate of racial disparity amongst its prison population, the highest rate of Black-white disparity amongst its prison population. Well, when that report was published, there was already a active effort to try to address racial disparity within the state of New Jersey. And that report garnered national attention. It was covered in national publications. It was also covered within states that were ranked high in the report, including New Jersey, given that it was ranked #1 at the time.
Yeah.
And the findings in the report and the earned media attention that it got helped to spur a response from the state legislature, given that New Jersey was ranked at the top of the list with this poor finding around racial disparity in the system, in its prison system. And it led to a new law. It led to the adoption of racial impact statements, which are similar to fiscal and environmental impact statements. We encourage them to be used prior to the adoption of sentencing changes. And the story we like to share, or the anecdote we like to share, is if in the mid-'80s, when Congress was adopting a bunch of those mandatory minimums that helped to, contribute to the growth of imprisonment in the country, including that crack powder sentencing disparity in the mid-'80s, that, if they had had the information, maybe Congress would have gone ahead and passed that mandatory minimum. But we would have hoped that if they had the information, that it would have slowed down the conversation. It would have created, a more deliberation on what exactly the response should be to this, this time where there was such a reactionary approach to increases in drug use, or, around the crack epidemic and other concerns or other fears related to drug use. And we can look at the response today around the opioid crisis. I mean, there's a lot to get into, there's a lot to unpack there. But one of the key reasons that the opioid crisis hasn't been so focused on imprisonment, the response to the opioid crisis hasn't been so focused on imprisonment, is that now we're more than 30 years into this mass imprisonment era, and people who were around in the 80s and 90s have already been a part of a response to drug use that focused on prison and incarceration, and know that it didn't work. So the efforts around the Sentencing Project's approach to release reports with the goal of shaping conversation and hopefully get a legal change or some sort of other practice change that can hopefully make improvements on what the findings have been in its research is a strategy, is an orientation that we're focused on. And I've seen that work. And that was true in New Jersey, although New Jersey continues to have a high rate of racial disparity in its prison system, despite the fact of that law passing a couple of years ago. So there's still a lot more work to be done, but that's the way in which the Sentencing Project works, is putting information out, hoping that information can be made use of by activists and other stakeholders who want to get progressive changes adopted within criminal legal systems at the federal, state, and local level, and then work to push those conversations and create more space for those conversations in areas where people are serious about, wanting to challenge mass incarceration.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as one of those activists who, recently was part of a group that created the 10 Demands for Justice, this initiative to abolish police and prisons, we certainly make great use of this research. It tells a really powerful story about the inequities in the system that, we'll touch on later. I'm curious about your thoughts on that approach as a response to this research, but irrespective of what is done with the research, none of us, whatever our intent would be, would be able to be as effective without this information. So it's incredibly important. I smiled when you mentioned the opioid crisis, though, because, I may be a little less, or I may be a little more negative than you. I don't know what the word is, but like, in my opinion, if I were asked about, why the opioid crisis is being handled differently, I would say it's because it's white people who have the opioid issue, and we had, like, as you mentioned, the disparity in crack versus cocaine sentences, which, after years of being 100 times different was like improved to still be 20 times different.
Yeah.
And then, like, you can hear the language of even a Democrat like Biden, and the others, creators of the crime bill, and how they speak about Black people and other people of color and poor people. I'm just curious about your thoughts on, like, even with this information, what percentage of the people do you think, like, are actually reading this and being like, this is pretty telling, versus like somehow manipulating a way to still be tough on crime, despite what you've said, that it doesn't work?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different pieces to the criminal legal system that contribute to the racial disparity, and so much that can't be, really confirmed through data, including the fact that anyone with discretion, bias shows up with anyone, who has discretion, from those police stops to, whether or not somebody will be admitted into jail prior to being sentenced, and then certainly during trial, whether or not someone chooses to go to trial and at sentencing. So there have been a lot of studies around that. We've worked to, use those research findings to frame information and give people the data, and that, paints a big picture so that it's clear that this is structural and it's systemic. It's not just about individual actors, and yet still, whether or not people are reading it is always a challenge, and how people act on that information, particularly if they have the power to do so, is also a challenge. But that is what we do. We put that information out there, acting, with the hope that the data will help to shape the conversation,
Right.
and help to reorient those progressive norms that reduce reliance on prison to begin with, and focus priorities, including, budgets and, other resources towards prevention.
Right.
I do think you're right that because of who is impacted by the opioid crisis, the response wasn't as punitive and as tough on crime as it was in the 80s, when the imagined, perpetrator or offenders around crack were assumed to be Black and other residents of color. So there's a lot to unpack there. And I think because of all of that, we have to identify, structural ways to change approaches to crime and approaches to public safety, knowing that when the assumed criminal is Black or of color, the outcomes look different. The crime responses look different when the assumed offender or perpetrator is white.
Right.
And we've seen that in the United States. So that's something to figure out, very intentional practices that can disrupt that history, or, those biases, is work for us to do. I hope that racial impact statement is one tool that can be included among that. And then there's a lot of work for us to do to identify and put in place other tools that can help disrupt those racial biases. The way racial biases, because we don't, we can assume that people with discretion, from street cops to judges, may have a bias that disadvantages Black and other defendants of color. And if they're, racist then that's something for us to, get them out of those positions where they can harm people's lives. But there's also structural work to do so that when biased practitioners are in those roles, that their bias can't disappear someone for the rest of their life. And there's very intentional work for us to do to figure out ways to change those structures within the system.
Yeah, and I think you're in a really interesting role because of, playing this middle kind of intermediary person connecting the activists and the research. So what led you to this role? What from your background, positioned you to take on this role, and what was it about it that seemed to make sense to you?
Yeah. Well, my brother was incarcerated when so we're twins. My brother was incarcerated when we were in our early 20s. And in addition to his incarceration, he was also, caught up in the juvenile justice system when we were teenagers. And he and his entire cohort of friends cycled in and out. And so just observing their experience and sort of understanding that how much it impacted my family, because there were so many collateral impacts that my brother's incarceration had at the time that I saw my mother suffer with, and just sort of general impact on my family, including all these stressors on my family. So that sort of inspired my interest in the issue, and then led me to sort of look more into it, study it while I was in school. And then I was, very fortunate. I've been very fortunate to be able to find employment doing this work and helping to move the conversation forward in my role at the Sentencing Project, and before I got here with previous, work that I was doing.
Yeah, it's not, something that people go into to get rich.
Definitely not.
And I've always wished that, like, I, was able to, that I didn't have to juggle a million different jobs, that I, had one job like yours where I knew that I was doing something positive, that touched me personally. And
Yeah.
I had
I
learned
do
about,
think.
no, go ahead.
Mhm. Well, I do think, I'm a very political person, and have been very politically active. Even when I was a teenager, I was just like reading through old journals and stuff. So I've always sort of been interested in politics. And I think even if I wasn't fortunate enough to have a paid work doing this, and this would be my issue, and this would be sort of where my activism would show up in
Right.
doing work around, anti-mass incarceration work.
Yep.
But I have been very fortunate to find paid employment doing it.
Yeah. And I feel, the same way. That's just always been, to me, it's a matter of justice and injustice. That's always been like the core thing that moved me.
Yeah.
And, I see this injustice, as you've talked about, from interactions on the street with police officers, all the way through, the courtrooms and sentencing, prosecution and sentencing, and I've experienced it, or I've witnessed it, the way that I have been treated, and how by cops, and how different it is. I've been in some scary situations, protesting, as well as a younger kid, making poor choices. But when I was older, and, I tweeted about this today because it came up about the NYPD, and just like the constant, unmarked vans, screeching to a halt and just clearing entire blocks. I would witness that on a regular basis, and they just would leave me there. Like, there were times when I was smoking a blunt on the stoop, and they left me there.
Because you were white.
I was
And
white.
they would black up all the black or brown kids.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's just, I can't tolerate that,
Mm-hmm.
So, now that we're heading toward the election, Another thing that I've been seeing a lot is voter suppression. Chomsky was on with, Bree recently, or yesterday even, I think, and said on her podcast and said that, it takes 10 minutes to vote. And then I woke up the next day and saw that people were waiting for 7 to 10 hours to cast their vote in Georgia.
Yeah.
Typically voter suppression targets predominantly Black communities, poor communities. And meanwhile, we're seeing, months of sustained protest against police violence. And we're also in the midst of COVID-19, making prisons and jails and other detention centers, more unsafe than ever before. What are your thoughts, in general on the criminal justice system today, how it intersects with these other systems, voting, for example, and the movement for racial and social justice that, is still going strong after all these months?
Yeah. Well, in Georgia specifically, there are hundreds of thousands of residents disenfranchised from voting in Georgia because they live in the community and they're on probation and parole. Georgia is in that category of states that does that. And, people can be sentenced for a crime, have spent time in jail pre-trial, but never go to prison. And their case outcome is a felony probation sentence. And in a state like Georgia, that probation term can be 10 years. And what often happens in Georgia, in my home state of Texas, is that young Black men get a felony charge for a drug offense, may get that charge when they're very young, a late teenager, 18, 19, early 20s, and then essentially are locked out of full civil and human rights for their entire 20s, which has this function of disenfranchising and marginalizing them, even when they get off paper, if they're able to make it through probation without any subsequent charge or new case. But what tends to happen
is hard, right?
It's so hard. It's, those first felony charges tend to be a gateway into keeping up contact with the criminal legal system that may lead to accumulation of other charges. And then if there is a serious charge a few years down the line, it makes it all the more likely that the person will go to prison as a result of it, and then be subjected, because of the way sentencing enhancements work, that they'll get the toughest penalty possible despite any other circumstances that might explain their criminal record to date, including the fact that they live in communities that are over policed, where there's an incredible likelihood that they will come in contact with a cop and they will end up with some sort of charge, even if those original charges didn't result in incarceration or imprisonment before. So felony disenfranchisement is a part of voter suppression efforts, and there's a long history around this in the United States during the post-Reconstruction period, as states like Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Virginia were all reconstituting themselves and adopting new constitutions following the Civil War. They intentionally used felony as a proxy, imagining certain felonies to be more likely to be committed by Black residents, and then those felonies were disqualifying felonies. Georgia is a specific example of this, and it's in that state's statutory code. There are a list of felonies that result in enhanced loss of civic and political rights and longer prison terms. It's called, so Georgia's sentencing statutory framework is very specific around that. And other states have a similar approach, like Mississippi and Alabama have these specified offenses in their state constitution that disqualify people from voting if they're convicted of those offenses. And in one example is that somebody can be convicted of murder in Mississippi and not be disqualified from voting for life because it wasn't originally on that list of crimes of moral turpitude, but they can be convicted of wife beating and disqualified from voting. And the assumption of the writers of that state's constitution at the time were that Black residents were more likely to beat their wives than kill their wives, and so they would disqualify specifically somebody for wife beating than murder. And there's a history around this in many state constitutions, particularly during that post-Reconstruction period. And so it's intentional. In my home state of Texas, over 300,000 people live in the community on felony probation. Probation terms can be very long. In the state of Texas, and to your point earlier, it can be a cycle. So once caught up on probation, people will cycle in and out for short periods of incarceration, 3 months here, 3 months 1 year, 6 months another year during their 10-month probation sentence. And it makes it very hard to maintain stable employment. Yeah. Not to mention when one is on felony probation, they can't vote and they can't do a range of things, and it's legal to discriminate against them in housing. Yep. And all sorts of other ways that many of us take for granted when we're just sort of trying to be adults and live our lives.
Right. And meanwhile, when they are in prison, they're counting for the census of the communities in which the prisons are held, not where they came from. And they're creating all kinds of income for those communities too, and clearly, not for the communities they've been removed from.
Yeah. I mean, we're in a census year where in most states, although there has been some movement on this over the years, but I'm not aware. I haven't been following this issue closely enough to be able to share with you which states have changed this policy. But there's this general issue around prison gerrymandering, where people who are in prison are counted where they are, not where they're from, which has this function of extracting political power from high incarceration communities, most of which are Black and brown communities in inner cities. And then placing that political power, or allowing rural communities to benefit from that political power, even though those individuals can't vote, and yet they're counted, which has the function of bumping up the population in those rural areas, advantaging them when it comes to the census and other sorts of political representation outcomes.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, that's definitely what's gone on in my state of New York for the longest time. And it just really paints this clear picture of, of the profit motive too, that, these rural communities that are like farming or, factory communities that are not doing well are able to sustain themselves through incarceration. So of course there's a motivation in the cities to arrest as many people as they possibly can so that they can create more jobs in corrections and, food and other things, for the prisons that are all housed upstate.
But the incentives at the city level, and this is what explains the high rate of arrest, particularly in New York, where the stop and frisk policy became so well known, that the number of arrests that police officers are expected to generate with a goal of proving themselves to be effective has contributed to that, regardless of who they're arresting and what crime they're actually observing, if any at all. Because for street cops, there's an incredible amount of pressure put on them to ramp up the number of arrests. And there's been a lot of, notorious reporting around that, where even some, police officers blew the whistle and reported meetings where their bosses, were pressuring them to drive up arrest numbers with the goal of meeting whatever quota, expected quotas they were supposed to achieve. And, there's been some popular information around this in, The Wire other, popular television shows and popular media. So it's just, notorious of what we know. And of course, there's a lot that we don't know. And in so many police agencies around the country where presumably the same culture, is contributing to high rates of arrest and has helped to drive prison admissions, and explains why the United States has one of the highest, has the highest rate of incarceration in the world.
Right. And, it's those kinds of things that make me feel like if the word reform is in it, as Angela Davis said, it's only going to serve to strengthen the system itself. Reforms have been tried over and over again for years to fix a supposedly broken system. But the way that I perceive it is that it's really running quite smoothly. It's doing exactly what it was intended to do as soon as slavery ended. And that's why we created 10 for Justice and believe that, abolition is really the only solution. So what are your thoughts now that you're seeing at least a preponderant, like a great increase in the number of calls for defunding, which, as far as we're concerned, is merely the first step on the road to abolition. And then you've seen efforts to defund that were kind of manipulated, again, like in New York, where, they celebrated, and by they, I mean like the politicians. I think the activists who were working on this understood what was happening, but they celebrated this $1 billion defunding, when in reality, what they did was they moved school police officers from the police budget to the education budget. We believe that as part of abolition, you start by defunding and reallocating those resources to those most impacted communities, and you defund to zero. Of course, at the end of the day, it doesn't happen overnight, but we're in a new place where police and prisons are no longer necessary. Do you think that that is possible? What are your thoughts on, the movement for defunding and abolition today?
So I think part of the effort around reshaping norms around responses to crime and what public safety should look like should definitely include conversation, should definitely include abolition. I don't see how you get to a complete, reorientation around of the social contract, which needs to happen in the United States, given just the ongoing oppression of entire communities, including, Black communities. And we just celebrated or marked the occasion around Indigenous Peoples Day yesterday, and so many other communities in this country that experience oppression, even if that oppression looks different than it did during the 50s or more than 150 years ago during slavery. And so there's so much to say, right? There's so much to unpack, but certainly abolition has to be part of the conversation. And the Sentencing Project and I work with radical activists who are trying to push that conversation from the left from a point of abolition. We work to include that. We may not, and I know you invited us and through me to sign on to the 10 demands, and I didn't do that. The Sentencing Project didn't do that, but that's not to say that we don't agree with the role of abolition in this conversation to help push and create more space for not just defunding the police, as you say, but actually getting to zero and reallocating priorities and responses to crime that don't focus on law enforcement, that don't reinforce the criminal legal apparatus in the way that it's been, that it has developed. In the history behind it, starting with slave patrols to now, on the streets of New York, ramping up arrest for, Black and brown youth through stop and frisk policies, that there's not a role for abolition in helping to push open space around, what public safety should be and what responses to crime should be. I often say that if in the United States, the criminal in and of itself wasn't imagined to be Black, then the responses to crime wouldn't be what they are. Stop and frisk wouldn't be legitimate, because most people in this country, including, white residents, wouldn't accept that practice as a legitimate one, even if they had a goal around public safety. But just like the abuse and the violence and the toxic interactions that that youth experience when police violently stop them, and that's viewed as acceptable practice because of some misguided goal around deterrence and incapacitation, that wouldn't be allowed to stand.
Yep.
And there are so many other examples when we compare the United States to the way other countries respond to crime, when violent crime increased in other parts of the world, but they did not respond with such, a toxic level of police force that they did in the United States.
Yeah. And, we're not always even responding, even if we're saying we're responding, like even if the media is reporting that we're responding. At the time that, the prison expansion kind of exploded, that was at the time that crime, especially violent crime, was going down. And however, media reports of those crimes increased fourfold. So, again, it says like one of those things where it's just this perception. And that's why I think, the research that you guys do is so important, because that's where we can show people who are questioning the validity of our arguments that being tough on crime, so to speak, does not actually reduce crime. That interactions with police actually increase the likelihood of future criminal activity.
Yes.
And that, what we constantly hear is like, what about rapists and murderers? Like, what if someone is at my house? But the research shows that cops don't stop crimes. They come and investigate crimes after they've happened, and then apparently only solve about 2% of them. So, to me, like that's the reason why I feel like if we were to defund, all these trillions of dollars could go into new mechanisms for, reparative justice, but also all kinds of programs that would decrease the crimes that everyone is so fearful of.
Right. Public safety doesn't just have to be about putting more cops on the street and allowing them to, violently stop, if not arrest, Black and brown youth. Your point is well taken and very important, because violent crime did increase in the United States in the 60s and 70s, but it also increased in Western Europe. It increased in Germany and Finland. And, there's reasons why internationally there were increases of crime during that time period, but not all Western countries did what United States did and respond to increases in crime with new prison cells. They responded to crime in the way you just suggested, with investing in social services with the goal of preventing contact with the legal system to begin with. So they responded to increases in crime with an expansion of early childhood education, with an expansion of services thrown at communities that were most at risk of committing crime, basically with the goal of identifying, specific practices known to reduce and prevent future contact with the system, such as guaranteeing housing, guaranteeing work, living wage work, so that people most at risk of committing crime were occupied and that their time was funneled into productive activity that gave them dignity, and that also allowed them agency over what they wanted to do, with the goal of trying to reduce the number of people who are getting arrested and being disappeared into prison. So there are other ways to respond to crime that just don't involve, more cops on the street and more arrest. But the United States, obviously focused in that way, as opposed to what other nations have done.
And do you think that is because of the profit motive? Do you think that's because of who is being targeted to work for slave wages in prisons?
I think it's about race. I definitely think it's about race. I think there are profit motives in it, but it's not just about for-profit companies.
No.
There's some notorious, yeah. Oh, so it is about these incentives that drive the system, given that the US is a capitalist system, that even public agencies,
Yeah.
Are focused on extracting resources with the way of like funding themselves. So we could like get real weedy on this, but I think there are a lot of incentives that drive that behavior in the United States.
Right.
I mean, Ferguson is a notorious example, and just horrific for anyone who read the Ferguson report, that sort of, offered the context for why Michael Brown was stopped and eventually killed. But just like this history of constantly stopping Black residents in this community with the goal of the police driving tickets for the local municipality to extract resources out of the most marginalized residents in that community because they needed to fund their agency.
Right.
And there's so many examples of that in communities and localities all across this country.
Yep. And that, that's why we, at 10 Demands didn't just like specifically target lofty goals of abolition, but tried to, lay this groundwork with things that can be done immediately, like ending all for-profit policing, ending cash bail, ending for-profit prisons, but not just corporate prisons, but all private public prison partnerships, ending surveillance and demilitarizing schools. These are all kind of, if you look at them as individual actions, they could really probably be seen as reforms, because it's not dismantling the system with each step, but if you put them all together, it leads in that direction. And I feel like that's the kind of thing that is more palatable for people as, as each of these steps is implemented, we see progress. And what seems so far-fetched about abolition right now, 10 years from now, if we're taking these steps that are drastic each and unto themselves, we're seeing the positive results. All of a sudden, abolition doesn't seem as crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that there's a lot of opportunity to work within a framework that abolition offers, if and at the same time honing in on specific changes that can be adopted now. So in the abolition framework through 10 Demands, it'd be great if there were certain localities to get stuff done in. And, you all may have a better sense of which localities it might be politically possible in the short term to, zero out funding for the police budget and then, reprioritize that funding towards a public safety framework that doesn't rely on law enforcement.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of opportunity for local coalitions to organize around that, or there should be.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that was one of the things that made the protests in Seattle more effective than others, because they had specific demands for defunding. We've tried to get, our flyers out to protests, but I think more to what you're saying, like we're trying to get the demands and kind of the context around them, like this alternative society that we envision, in the hands of people who can make these changes at the local, state, and federal levels.
There are progressive localities, very extremely progressive localities all across the country. I mean, I live in DC, which likes to imagine itself to be a progressive city. That's what politicians claim, self-describe themselves out. So, it'd be something to try here. And there are attempts to try. There's a lot of activism being led by Stop Police Terror, which is a local group, and then also Black Lives Matter, DC.
DC is one of the places that we had the flyers, and
Great.
where activists were out on the streets with them. All right.
There's also, let me just add, there's also like extremely progressive localities that have done things like authorized voting for undocumented immigrants, right? Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is jokingly but lovingly referred to as the Republic of the Tacoma Park, might be a place to try a very progressive public safety strategy. And presumably there are progressive localities like that all across the country where if a local coalition could try to implement some of these strategies, it may be able to get done.
Yeah, see, that's an interesting point that I think you're suggesting, doing it even on a smaller scale in smaller municipalities that could then, not only be really effective and benefit those areas, but also serve as case studies that could then be, proof of the benefits of adoption in larger circumstances.
Yeah, because it would show that it is politically possible to do it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's a matter of legwork. There's not enough.
It is, it is a matter of capacity, right, to actually act on these ideas and move these ideas forward.
But that's why, we're trying, and it's like, I guess it's a rush because people are dying. It's like it's a rush because families and communities are being destroyed every day. And to hear, the majority of our members who are Black or Indigenous or even just, women and what they experience, it adds a lot of urgency. But at the same time, we need to be strategic. We need to make sure that we have all of our stuff ready and we can make these connections with these local organizations, because we can't be everywhere. So before I let you go, we just moving back out from the local to the national, again, I mentioned the election. We have someone who's, in office now, who's a fascist, who has, celebrated, mercenary attacks on the left, attacks by the right on the left, who who we need to remove from office. But then on the other hand, I ask this question because of the work that you do and your experience with your brother and his friends and kind of what radicalized you at a young age. The person who's running against him wrote the crime bill, was a segregationist, and to this date, today, says we need to increase police funding. Who are you voting for? And what's that? And I'm happy to share my take on it too, so you're not alone in this. But how do you justify? Because I can't imagine you're voting for Trump, but are you willing to vote?
You would be right about that.
What's that?
Let me explicitly say, just because I feel I have to, that the Sentencing Project is a nonpartisan organization. And so the Sentencing Project does not endorse political candidates at all. So in my personal capacity, yes, I am not voting for Trump. And I see my vote for his opponent, for Biden, as harm reduction for the United States to prevent future harm from happening if 45 were to get another 4 years in office. And I think that Biden, at the end of the day, followed the politics. And when the crime bill got adopted in the early 90s, everybody was not everybody, a majority of people in elected office were on the bandwagon of disappearing Black and brown youth into lockups and not supportive of alternatives. Right. The Sentencing Project was trying to push alternatives at the time, and there was also a coalition of Congressional Black Caucus members that were, but the political calculus was not on our side, and was not on the side of anti-mass incarceration activists in the early 90s. And as a senator from Delaware, Biden was not on the right side of history at that time. I do, and his VP candidate as the former AG, Attorney General of California, and then subsequent current elected senator from California, had to cater to the state interest, which also doesn't just include Black and brown residents in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, but also includes rural white residents in Orange County and other rural counties throughout California, which has a function of had made her conservative and sort of speaking to that part of the electorate.
To say the least, conservative.
To say the least. Yeah. I will say that, I have hope that they can be pushed from the left around progressive changes in the criminal legal system that not just have a forward-looking approach, but also can help repair the harm of the 94 crime bill and of the policies that Kamala contributed to as Attorney General in California and through her tenure as a U.S. Senator if they're elected, and that it'll be on us to push them. And I'm going to be right there, creating and supporting a left flank to that when they get elected, to the presidency and vice presidency, they can be pushed from the left to not just talk about going forward, but also to help look back and repair the harm that got people locked up in the 90s and that got people locked up in California under Kamala's tenure as well.
Yeah. And that's kind of the take that I took. I was on a recent debate show, and there were three of us debating, and I was the only one who said I was going to vote for Biden. And I think it was the first time that I'd publicly said it. I'm certainly not leveraging my minor celebrity to promote him by any means, because I still pray there's a miracle and he's not my choice, my only choice.
That you're talking about is there a write-on strategy happening?
No.
Will penetrate? Let me just say that he definitely followed the politics. At the end of the day, these are people who, and he has said that he's only going to go for one term, which might open him up to be as progressive as possible, given the history that I think he will want his legacy to be, to reflect well on his history. And so he might be very personally motivated to anchor progressive changes, including repairing the harm of the 94 crime bill. And I'll say in California in particular, Jerry Brown, during his last administration, became very progressive in wanting to champion criminal legal reform at the end. Even, when Kamala was in there, I think he overlapped with Kamala as AG. And the same could be true of a Biden presidency, and the same might be true of a VP for Harris. As VP, Biden, during the Obama administration, was responsible, and he was the lead on the crack powder reform that you kind of touched on earlier. No, it didn't zero out the disparity, the 100-to-1 disparity. It just reduced it to 18-to-1. But Biden was the White House's lead on that change. And so he follows the politics on this stuff as a politician, and, presumably would do that during his presidency as well.
All right. So given that hope, how, and just taking something not directly criminal justice, but if 80% of the country is for Medicare for all, and he's still saying he's against it, why should we have any faith that, knowing he's doing everything he can to sound as conservative as possible in going against someone who's as far right as you can get in this country? Why should we have faith of what you're saying when he's showing us the opposite right now? And then I just
think it'll be on us to continue to push.
Yeah. All right.
And we might continue to be disappointed, yeah. But I think it is still on us to continue to push, because if we don't do that, then what else is there?
Well, we focus on Cori Bush, running for Congress in Missouri.
That is, yeah. And I think getting Cori Bush in office will help increase the progressive coalition, the squad. It'll add more members to the squad, being led by AOC and Ayanna Pressley and Omar and Jayapal. No, Tlaib. Yeah. draft law is great too, though.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think if we can increase the numbers in the squad, then that will definitely help to push open more progressive norms coming out of Congress. And then we got to get a coalition of similarly, politically oriented senators who can help push it from that chamber as well.
Yeah, word. I have a little more faith in that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I don't want to keep you too long. I think we're almost at an hour. So is there anything else that you think, my vastly leftist listening base should know about you, about the Sentencing Project, or if you have any messages for the Nazis who troll me and use these interviews against me, anything for them?
I just, I don't have anything to say to any Nazis, but I will say to the left that it is on the radical left to help push these conversations further and, use our information and also engage directly with me at the Sentencing Project around ideas that can help push conversations forward. And I will say, like, one of the strategies that I'm most excited about is actually expanding the vote to people who are in prison.
Yes.
And I think if we can continue to expand the electorate and expand the franchise to ensure that nobody loses their right to vote, then hopefully ideas can become norms can become even more progressive in the United States.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much for the time and for everything you do. I love your group. A huge fan of yours. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me this afternoon.
My pleasure. Bye.
Okay.